My name is Robert Hayes, and at 72 years old, I thought I understood what family meant, until the Christmas that changed everything. On Christmas morning, I woke before dawn, the way I had every December these past 47 years. The difference was that for the first time since 1978, I was waking up alone. Margaret had been gone for 5 months now. 5 months since the cancer finally won its quiet war, leaving me in our 3-bedroom colonial in Millfield, Pennsylvania, surrounded by 4 decades of shared memories and the echo of her laughter in empty rooms. Today was going to be different. Today, I was going to cook the Christmas dinner Margaret always made. Her famous herb-crusted prime rib, garlic mashed potatoes, and the green bean casseroles that even our son Daniel used to sneak seconds of when he thought we weren't looking. Today, Daniel and his wife Sarah were coming home. Hannah had been planning this meal for weeks, calling Daniel in early November to make sure they'd be free. "Of course, Dad," he'd said, his voice warm over the phone. "Sarah and I wouldn't miss it. Mom's first Christmas away. We should all be together." The morning light filtered through the frost-covered prime rib from the refrigerator, where it had been marinating, shell since yesterday. Margaret's recipe, written in her careful script on an index card now stained with decades of Christmas dinners, guided my hands as I rubbed the herbs into the meat. Rosemary, thyme, garlic powder, and just a pinch of paprika for color. The house smelled like Christmas. Pine from the Fraser fir I'd wrestled into the living room corner 2 weeks ago, cinnamon from the candles, and now the earthy richness. I'd even used her good china, the Lenox set with the tiny gold rim that only came out for holidays and special occasions. By noon, the table was set for 3. The prime rib rested under foil, the potatoes were fluffy, waiting in their serving bowl, and the green bean casserole bubbled golden in the oven. The house looked exactly like it had every Christmas of Daniel's childhood. Warm lights twinkling on the tree, Christmas carols playing softly from the old stereo, and wrapped presents underneath the branches. 4:47 p.m. They'd said they'd be here by 1. I walked to the front window and looked down the driveway. Empty. At 1:30, I called Daniel's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. At 1:45, I heard a car in the driveway. As I hurried to the front door, smoothing my sweater and flight-checking my reflection in the hallway mirror, through the frosted glass, I could see a figure approaching the porch. Z opened the door to find a young man in a FedEx uniform holding an envelope. "Robert Harlem Hayes?" he asked, his breath visible in the cold air. "Yes," I said, confusion creeping into my Rutgers. "Delivery for you, sir. Merry Christmas." He meant me the envelope and was walking back to his truck before I could fully process what was happening. The sound of his engine fading down the street left me standing in my doorway, holding an envelope with my name written in Sarah's precise handwriting. I closed the door and walked back to the kitchen, where the sight of the perfectly set table made my chest tighten. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. "Robert, we decided to spend Christmas with my parents in Vermont this year. We figured you'd understand since you have so many memories of Christmas with Margaret there. We'll call you later. Love, Sarah and Daniel." Then, a third time, waiting for the words to change into something that made sense. No explanation. No apology. No, "We're sorry for the short notice," or "We hope you'll join us next year." Just a casual assumption that I'd understand why they'd chosen to abandon me on Christmas Day. I sank into one of the dining room chairs, the envelope still in my homage. And around me the house hummed with the pulled warmth of a Christmas dinner no one would eat. The prime rib now cooling under its foil tent, the mashed potatoes growing a skin in their serving bowl. The green bean casserole, its crispy onions losing their crunch. For a moment I just sat there, letting the magnitude of their casual cruelty wash over me. They hadn't forgotten. They'd made a choice, a deliberate, calculated choice to leave the first Christmas without Margaret. I thought about all the Christmases they'd missed over the years, always with a reason, always with the promise that regulated somehow. Sarah's family, work obligations, the long drive from Philadelphia. But this year, when it mattered most, when the empty chair at the table belonged to their mother and my wife of 46 years, they'd chosen to be somewhere abolished. My phone buzzed against the table. A text message. I picked it up, hoping irrationally that they'd changed their minds, that they were pulling into the driveway with sheepish smiles and apologies. Instead, it was a photo. Sarah's Instagram story. A long dining room table laden with food, surrounded by her parents, her sister's family, and there, at the far end, Daniel, unrestricted, and Sarah, raising wine glasses towards the camera. The caption read, "Grateful for family time, part." Hashtag Christmas blessing, hashtag Vermont, hashtag family first. I stared at the photo until the screen dimmed. Daniel was smiling the same smile I remembered from his childhood Christmas mornings, the one that used to light and mistake up our living room when he discovered what Santa had brought. Now that smile was reserved for another family's table, another family's traditions. Z set the phone down carefully, as if it might shatter, and looked around at the dining room Margaret and I had shared for so many years. The Christmas china caught the afternoon light, each place setting a small monument to tradition and hope. The centerpiece, pine boughs and red candles, sat between the unused plates like a memorial to celebrations that would never come again. Outside, snow began to fall in soft, fat flakes, the kind Margaret used to call Christmas card snow. She would have stood at this very window, watching it dust the bare branches of the maple tree she'd planted when we first moved in. She would have said something about how beautiful it looked, how perfect it was for Christmas. But Margaret was gone, and Daniel and Sarah were raising toasts in Vermont, and I was sitting alone in a house full of food and memories and the growing understanding that something fundamental had shifted in my life. I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I stood up slowly, my knees creaking in the submerged mornings, and began clearing the table. The china went back into the cabinet, each plate carefully nested in its tissue paper. The silverware returned to its felt-lined drawer. The food went into containers in the refrigerator, portion-sized for one. As I worked, my hands moving through the familiar motions of cleanup, I felt something cold and cleared settling in my chest. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was recognition. The understanding that this Christmas had revealed something that had been building for years, something I'd been too hopeful or teammate too stubborn to see. They didn't need me anymore. Somewhere along the way, I'd become optional in their locksmith, a box to check when convenient, a tradition to maintain when it didn't conflict with better offers. The last thing I put away was the centerpiece. As I carried it to the basement storage room, past the boxes of Christmas brush decorations that would now seem pitifully optimistic when I packed them away again, I caught my reflection in window at the bottom of the stairs. I looked like what I was, a 72-year-old man holding the remnants of a Christmas that never was, standing in the basement house that suddenly felt too big, too quiet, too full of echoes. But, Gratwood Mint is at the centerpiece on its shelf next to boxes labeled in Margaret's handwriting, Christmas dishes, tree ornaments, holiday linens. I felt something /Mel stirring beneath the disappointment. Something harder, more determined. Margaret had been gone for 5 months, but her voice was still clear on register my memory. Robert Hayes, she used to say when I was being too passive, too accommodating. You don't have to accept everything that comes your way. Sometimes you get to choose what happens next. Standing in that basement, surrounded by the artifacts of Christmases past and present, I realized she was right. For the first time in months, maybe years, I had a choice to make. I just wasn't sure yet what that choice would be. The day after Christmas dawned gray and bitter, the kind of cold that seeps in and settles in your bones. I woke early again, but this time not from excitement, crimson, or anticipation, from the simple fact that sleep had become elusive since Margaret's passing, and yesterday's revelation had made it impossible altogether. I made coffee in the automatic maker Margaret had insisted we buy 2 years ago, before her diagnosis. "It'll be easier," she'd said, though I suspected, even then, trespass, that she was thinking about mornings I might face alone. The coffee was weak. I still hadn't mastered her proportions, but it was hot, and I wrapped my hands around Pess, the mug, as I stood at the kitchen window. Snow from yesterday had stopped, leaving the world outside, pristine and quiet. Across the street I could see the warm glow of the Peterson family's windows, probably gathered around, acclaims, opening the presents that yesterday had been too overwhelming to get to. I should have felt sorry for myself. I should have spent the morning wallowing in the sting of abandonment, maybe calling Daniel to demand angrily an explanation I'd probably never get. Instead, I found myself drawn to Margaret's study, the small room off the living room where she'd paid bills, organized our taxes, and spent countless hours planning the trips we'd take when Robert retires. The room had been untouched since her death. Her reading glasses still sat on the desk next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. Her calendar still showed September, the month she'd entered hospice care. Even her coffee cup, washed and put away by one of the many well-meaning neighbors who'd helped during those final weeks, sat in its usual spot next unborn. I'd avoided this room for months, unable to face the weight unborn business and interrupted plans. But something about yesterday, the casual cruelty of that envelope, the Instagram photo of Daniel's refreshed new chosen family, had shifted something inside me. I needed to understand what Margaret had been thinking in those final months, what she'd seen coming that I'd been too grief-stricken to notice. I started with the desk drawers, methodically working through unized files. Margaret had always been meticulous about paperwork. Every warranty, every insurance document, every receipt, carefully labeled, shortened, and filed. The top drawer held the usual suspects: stamps, paper clips, a calculator that hadn't worked she'd refused to throw away. Northwestern drawer was more interesting. Bank statements going back 2 years, all neatly organized by month. As I flipped through them, I noticed something I'd missed: familiarity of her final illness. Significant withdrawals, always in round numbers, always from our savings account. Demolished in March, $10,000 in June, $15,000 in August. Undermined Great had been moving money, and she hadn't told me about it. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old tax exhibited, my fingers found something unhead. A manila envelope with my name written across the front, in Margaret's familiar handwriting. The paper was crisp, new, nothing like the yellowed documents that surrounded it. I sat down in her chair and opened it carefully. Inside were 3 items: a key I didn't recognize, a deed to property I'd never heard of, and a letter in Margaret's careful script. "Robert, you're reading this, it means something has happened that I hoped we'd never face. Daniel and Sarah have shown you who they really are, and you're probably feeling lost and betrayed. I understand. I saw it coming months ago, and I've been preparing for the moment." The key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank, box 247. Inside you'll find documents that explain everything. The deed is for a small property I purchased in Pine Grove, about 40 minutes north of Millfield. It's in your name only. Daniel and Sarah have no claim to it. You're probably angry that I kept this from you, but I needed to protect you in a way that wouldn't make you suspicious of our son while I was still alive. Some battles are better fought from beyond the grave. You are not alone, and you are not powerless. The choices you make from here forward are yours and yours alone. Undermined, Margaret. P.S. Call Henry Firefox. He's expecting your call. 3 times before setting it down with shaking hand. Henry Morrison was the attorney who'd handled our wills and Margaret's estate planning. I'd spoken to him several times during her final months, but always about standard flattened issues: probate, beneficiaries, tax implications. He'd never mentioned anything about Pine Grove or safety deposit boxes or Daniel showing his true nature. Margaret had been playing a longer game than I'd ever imagined. I picked up the phone and dialed Henry's direct number, expecting to leave a voicemail undermined on the day after Christmas. Instead, he answered on the second ring. Sudgy's warm but unsurprised. I was wondering when you'd call. Henry, I found Margaret's letter. What the hell is going on? Why don't you come in tomorrow morning? I think it's time we had a conversation. Your wife made me promise to delay until you were ready for it. The Pine Grove property turned out to be a small cabin on 12 acres of wooded land, nestled beside a clear water resisted that reflected the winter sky like a mirror. I'd never seen it before, never heard Margaret mention it, never even known she was interested in real estate beyond our family home. The cabin was simple but well-maintained: 2 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, a kitchen with windows that out over the water. Everything inside was new: furniture, linens, even a pantry stocked with insatiables. It was as if Margaret had been preparing a refuge, a place where someone could tarn from the world for as long as necessary. On the kitchen table was another envelope with my name on it. "This is yours," the note inside read. "No unthinkable knows about it. No one else can touch it. Use it however you need to." Zhang spent the afternoon walking the property, following trails that led to a small dock, a fire pit surrounded by Adirondack chairs, and a workshop that looked like it had been recently stocked with tools. The silence here was different from the silence of our house in Millfield. Not empty, but expectant, as if the woods themselves trespassed to see what story would unfold next. As the sun began to set over the lake, painting the sky in shades trademarks that money that Margaret would have loved, I understood what she'd given me. It wasn't just property, it was possibility, a place where I could think clearly, away from the weight of 46 years of shared memories and the sting of yesterday's betrayal. I drove back to Millfield that evening with Margaret's key in my pocket and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since her diagnosis. Tomorrow, I would visit Henry Morrison and learn the full extent of my wife's final strategy. Tomorrow, I would begin to understand seen coming that I'd been too trusting to recognize. But tonight, for the first time since Christmas morning, I felt something other than grief and abandonment. Tonight, I felt grateful for Margaret's foresight, for her protection, and for the growing understanding that the story of Robert Hayes wasn't over yet. It was just beginning a new chapter. Blankets Morrison's law office occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian house on Millfield's Main Street, the kind of place where serious conversations happened behind heavy wooden doors. I'd been there many times over the years, for our wills, for the purchase of our house, for the legal framework of Margaret's final illness, but never with the sense of anticipation I felt climbing those familiar stairs. Henry himself hadn't changed much in the 15 years I'd known him. Still tall and lean, still wearing the same style wire-rimmed glasses, still carrying himself with the careful dignity of a man who'd spent decades keeping other people's secrets. But when he shook my hand in his office doorway, I caught something in his trick expression I'd never seen before. Sympathy, mixed with a grim sort of satisfaction. "Your wife," he said, as we settled into the tight and there but most strategically minded people I've ever worked with. And I've represented some very calculating individuals over the years. He opened a thick file folder on the small table between us. Inside were documents I'd never seen, correspondence in Margaret's handwriting, and what looked like a timeline spanning the last 2 years of her life. She first came to see me in March of 2021, Henry began, about 18 months before her diagnosis. She said she was concerned about Daniel and Sarah's financial situation and about some things she'd overheard during their last visit. I frowned. What kind of things? According to Margaret's notes, they spent most of that weekend cabbage discussing your finances. How much the house was worth, what your retirement accounts flushing looked like, whether you had long-term care insurance. Daniel apparently made a comment about how lucky it was that you owned your home outright because it would make things easier when the time comes. The words hit me like cold water. I remembered that weekend, Daniel and Sarah's first visit in almost a year, supposedly to celebrate Sarah's promotion at the marketing firm where she worked. They'd seemed unusually interested in the renovations we'd done, asking detailed questions JFK about the new roof, the updated electrical system, the refinished hardwood floors. At the time, I thought they were just making conversation. Watch Margaret started moving assets that month, Henry continued. Not large humility aunts, nothing that would trigger questions from you or raise red flags with the bank. But over the course of 18 months, she transferred nearly $150,000 touch. $150,000? I stared at him. From where? Your savings, mostly. Some from the sale of her mother's jewelry, some from a small inheritance you'd forgotten about. She was very careful to make it look like normal household expenses, home improvements, medical bills, charitable donations. She remnants created fake receipts. I thought about those bank statements I'd found, the pattern of withdrawals, Jang, that had puzzled me. Margaret hadn't been careless or forgetful. She'd been deliberately creating a financial safety net I didn't know existed. Why didn't she tell me? Henry's expression softened. She said you would have tried to talk her out of it. You would have insisted on giving Daniel and Sarah the benefit of the doubt, on trusting them to do right, combating by you. She loved that about you. But she also knew it would trimmed made you vulnerable. He pulled out another document, a property deed with my name as the sole owner. The Pine Grove cabin was purchased in July of 2021, 6 months before her cancer diagnosis. She paid cash, set it up as a revocable trim trust, with you as the primary beneficiary and trustee. Even if something happened to you, the property would go to the American Legion, not to Daniel. I studied declaration, the deed, trying to process the complexity of what she'd essentially created a parallel financial structure, invisible to our son, designed to protect me from stringifies she hoped would never arise. There's more, Henry said gently. After unthinkable, her diagnosis. When she knew her time was limited, she became even more methodical. She documented every conversation with Daniel and Sarah, every request for financial wretch information. Ed's talk team, they were planning for your future without consulting you. He handed me a small notebook, bound in brown leather. Margaret's doc team handwriting filled every page. Dates, times, stations, talk team, I'd been present for but hadn't really heard. November 15, 2022. Daniel asked if we, talk team, had updated our wills since my diagnosis. When I said yes, he asked if the house would, talk team, go to him directly, or if there would be complications. Sarah suggested it might be easier for everyone if I signed a power of attorney, giving them authority over finances. December 3rd, 2022. Sarah mentioned that talk team, her friend's father, moved to assisted living right after his wife died because it was just too much for him to handle alone. She said they had looked at some really nice places in the area, just in case. Daniel nodded, talk team, unborn, and said it was good to be prepared. December 18th, 2022. During Christmas planning, Sarah asked if we were planning /Gutch to scale back celebrations this year. When I said we were looking forward to having them here as always, she exchanged a look with Daniel, and said they needed to, quote, talk about expectations, unquote, after I was gone. Page after page of careful observations, building a picture of two Gumbash people who were planning my future while my wife was dying. Clay's made me promise not to tell you about any of this until after her death. Henry said. She wanted your grief to be pure, uncontaminated by suspicion, unquote, about Daniel's motives. But she also wanted you protected if those motives became action. I closed the notebook and sat back in my chair. Outside Henry's window, Millfield's main street bustled with post-Christmas activity. Shoppers returning gifts, families walking off holiday/shoots, meals, the ordinary rhythm of a close, small-town life, continuing, as if my world hadn't just shifted on its axis. So what happens now? Craze I asked. Now you decide what kind of man you want to be going forward, Henry said. Margaret gave you options. You can confront Daniel and Sarah directly, you can wait to see what they do next, or you can simply disappear into the life she created for you at Pine Grove. And if they come after me legally, they can try. But Margaret was very thorough. Every asset transfer was legitimate, every document properly filed, every decision well within her legal rights as a spouse. The cabin is yours, the money is yours, and the evidence of their intentions is documented in their own words. I left Henry's office with a cardboard box full of documents and a head full of questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. The drive home took me past the elementary school where Daniel had played Little League, the ice cream shop where we'd celebrated his high school graduation, the church where Margaret and I had attended his wedding to Sarah 8 years ago. All those memories, all those moments of pride and hope and unconditional love, now viewed through the lens of Margaret's careful observations. Had Daniel always been calculating behind his smiles? Had Sarah always been measuring our worth in terms of eventual inheritance? Or had something changed over the years, turning the little boy who's to help me wash the car into a man who could abandon his father on Christmas Day? That evening, as I sat in Margaret's study, incorporates through her notebook for the 3rd time, my phone rang. Daniel's name through the caller ID, and for a moment I hesitated. Then I answered. Dad, how was your Christmas? Couldn't connect yesterday. Sarah's family had this whole thing planned, and you know how her mother gets when plans change. His voice was casual. Lal had happened, as if abandoning me with a FedEx delivery was just a minor scheduling conflict. It was quiet, I said carefully. Well, that's probably for the best, right? I mean, the first Christmas without Libertine, it must have been hard. Maybe it was better not to have all the fuss and noise. There it was, the subtle reframing that Margaret had documented so carefully. My abandonment became my preference. Their absence became a gift they'd given me. Sarah and I were talking, Daniel continued, and we think it might be good for you to get out more. Maybe think about some changes. The house is so big for just one person, and with winter coming. Changes? Well, you know, maybe something smaller, easier to maintain. There's some really nice senior communities in the area, places where you wouldn't have to worry about yard work and repairs and all that. More social opportunities, too. I looked around Margaret's study, at the notebooks and documents. Line backs revealed the careful architecture of her protection. Daniel was following the script she'd predicted almost word for word. Why, I'll think about it, I said. That's great, Dad. Really great. Sarah, Bisley's found some brochures online. We could maybe visit a few places this weekend, just to get a sense of what's available. This weekend? No pressure. You know, it's good to be informed. And Dad? We should probably talk about some practical stuff soon. Financial planning, making sure all your paperwork is up to date, that kind of thing. Sarah's really good with that stuff. She could help organize everything, make sure nothing falls through cracks. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness, unthinkable of Margaret's study, and felt the last of my illusions about my son crumble away. He wasn't calling to apologize for Christmas, or to check on my emotional well-being. He was calling to begin the process Margaret had seen coming 2 years ago. Technological, of moving me out of my life and into one they could control. But Margaret had given me something Daniel and Sarah didn't know about: time, resources, and the clear-eyed documentation of their intentions. They thought they were playing against a grieving, confused old man. They were wrong. The attack came sooner than I expected, and with more sophistication Theodore 4. It was a Thursday morning in early February, the kind of gray winter day tranny that makes you forget what sunshine looks like. I was having coffee and working through the newspaper's crossword puzzle, a habit I'd inherited from Margaret, when the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see a woman in a partnail suit standing on my porch, holding a clipboard and looking official. My first thought was that she was from the county, maybe here about property taxes or some municipal issue. I opened the door with a casual politeness you'd show any bureaucrat doing their job. "Mr. Hayes? I'm Linda Martinez from Adult Protective Services. I'd like to speak with you about some concerns that have been brought to our attention." The words hit me like ice water. Adult Protective Services. The phrase carried implications that made my stomach clench. Elder abuse, neglect, incompetence. I'd seen the news stories, heard the warnings at senior shirt center presentations about predatory family members and financial exploitation, but I'd never imagined being on the other side of that equation. "What kind of concerns?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "May I come in? It's probably better if we discuss this privately." I stepped aside to let her enter, my mind racing through everything Von Morrison had told me about Margaret's preparations. Had she anticipated this, too? Incarcerated Martinez was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of professional demeanor that suggested she'd done this many times before. She settled into Margaret's chair in the living room and opened her folder. "Hayes, we received a report from your son, Daniel Hayes, expressing concern about freight and your ability to live independently. According to the report, you've been making concerning financial decisions, you're socially isolated, and there have been incidents, flirting that suggest possible cognitive decline." The words came out in the measured tone of someone reading from a script, but each one felt like a last-name accusation. I thought about Daniel's phone call, about his casual mention of senior communities and financial planning. He'd been gathering information, building a case. "What kind?" "Farudga?" I asked. She consulted her notes. "Failure to maintain the property. Apparently the gutters haven't been cleaned, and there are ice dams forming on the roof. Unpaid bills that have resulted in service warnings. Confusion about medication schedules. And recently giving away large sums of freezes to questionable charities." Each item was a distortion of something real. Yes, I'd been putting off the gutter keeper charge until spring, a decision based on practical safety, not neglect. They were legitimate charities I'd researched carefully. And the medication confusion? That was from a single incident 6 months ago, when I'd taken my morning pills twice because I'd been distracted by a call from Margaret's hospice nurse. Daniel had taken the ordinary struggles of an older widower learning to live alone and reframed them as evidence of incompetence. "Mrs. Martinez," I said carefully, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm managing just fine. My son might be worried, but his concerns are overblown."
"I'm certain to be all ready. If cling thee."
"I understand this is difficult, Mr. Hayes. No one wants to admit they're struggling, but my job is to make sure you're safe and that your interests are being protected. Your son has provided documentation of his concerns, and frankly, some of them are quite serious." She pulled out a manila folder and showed me photocopies of documents I recognized. Bank statements showing Margaret's transfers, the deed to the Pine Grove Shelm property, even medical records from immersed oncologists showing my presence at her appointments. But the context was all wrong. The bank statements were presented as evidence of financial confusion. The property deed was described as a questionable real estate transaction, with unclear financing. My frequent presence at Margaret's medical appointments was characterized as possible signs of dependent relationship and difficulty accepting spouse's death. Daniel and Sarah had taken the legitimate steps I'd taken to care for my dying wife and protect our assets, and they'd weaponized them presumption against me. Mrs. Martinez, I need to call my attorney.
Of course, that's your right. But Mr. Hayes, I should tell you that your son has also filed a petition for emergency guardianship. He's asking the court to grant him immediate authority over your financial and medical decisions while we conduct a full assessment of your situation. The room seemed to tilt. Emergency guardianship. I'd heard those words before in the context of seniors who'd suffered strokes or dementia, people who genuinely couldn't make decisions for themselves. But I was sitting here having a coherent conversation, demonstrating exactly the timeless of competence they were claiming I lacked. When is the hearing? Next Tuesday. That's why I'm here today, to complete my assessment and make a recommendation to the court. 6 days. Daniel had given me 6 days to prepare for a legal battle that could strip away my independence entirely. After Linda Martinez left, I called Henry Morrison immediately. He listened to my summary of the visit without interruption, asking only occasional questions about specific details. Emergency guardianship petitions are hard to fight, he said finally. The court's Warren position is to err on the side of caution. If there's any question about competence, they'll often grant temporary givingship while ordering a full evaluation. So Daniel could win? He could. But Margaret anticipated this too, Robert. She left us some tools to work with. The next morning, Henry and I met at Pine Grove. I'd driven up the night before, needing the clarity that the cabin's silence could provide. Henry arrived with 2 other people, a geriatric psychiatrist named Dr. Sarah Chen and a private investigator named Marcus Webb. Margaret hired Marcus 6 months before she died, Henry explained, as we sat around the cabin's kitchen table. She wanted documentation of Daniel and Sarah's behavior that went beyond her personal observations. When Marcus was a compact man in his 50s with the kind of alert eyes that suggested he missed very little. He opened a laptop and pulled up a series of files. "Your daughter-in-law is interesting," he said, without preamble. Sarah Mitchell Hayes. She's been researching elder law attorneys for the past 8 months, visiting senior living facilities and having conversations distressed with real estate agents about property values in your neighborhood. Showed me printouts of internet searches, credit card records, and even security camera footage from a senior living facility called Willowbrook Manor. In the video, Sarah could be seen talking to an administrator, taking notes and picking up brochures. 3 weeks after your wife's death, Marcus said, she was asking to get placement options for a recently widowed relative who couldn't handle living alone. Dr. Chen leaned forward. "I'm going to conduct a comprehensive confessed cognitive assessment that we can present to the court. Based on my conversation with you this morning, I don't expect to find any talk deficits that would justify guardianship, but we need formal documentation to counter their claims." Over the next 4 days, I submitted to the most thorough example of my mental state I'd ever experienced. Dr. Chen tested my memory, my decision-making ability, my understanding of financial concepts, even my emotional stability. She interviewed me about my daily routines, my social connections, my plans for the future. Marcus, meanwhile, continued his investigation, all into Daniel and Sarah's activities. What he found was a pattern of behavior that stretched back months before Margaret's death. Conversations with financial planners about inherited assets, inquiries about power of attorney procedures, even consultations with interior designers about modernizing a traditional home for quick sale. When they hadn't just been planning my future, they'd been planning my erasure. The night before the hearing, I sat on the cabin's deck, Hemmer sunset reflect off the lake's still surface. Margaret had chosen this place well. It was peaceful in a way that made clear thinking possible, isolated enough that interruptions unnamed, beautiful enough that hope felt sustainable, even in dark circumstances. I thought about the man I'd been 6 months ago, recently widowed, trusting in my son's love, focused on grief rather than protection. That man would have been helpless against what Daniel and Sarah had orchestrated. He would have signed papers he didn't understand, moved to facilities he didn't tallest, lived out his remaining years trustworthy as a managed asset rather than an autonomous person. But Margaret had given me tools unthinkable I was only beginning to understand how to use. Tomorrow, I would find out whether her foresight had been enough. May Millfield County Courthouse was built in 1923, during an era when public buildings were designed to inspire both respect and intimidation. Walking up its granite steps on that Tuesday morning, I felt the weight of both. The building's imposing facade seemed to announce that important decisions were made here, decisions that could alter the course of a person's life in ways they might never recover from. I'd been inside before, for jury duty, for Margaret's estate proceedings, for the mundane civic responsibilities that come with small-town life, but never with the knowledge that my fundamental independence hung in the balance. Henry Morrison met me in the lobby, carrying a briefcase that looked substantial enough to contain Margaret's entire strategy. Dr. Chen was with him, looking professional and calm, in a way that I hoped would translate into credibility with the judge. Marcus Webb nodded at me from across the lobby. He wouldn't be testifying, but his research would be blackmail of our defense. On the other side of the lobby, Daniel and Sarah sat with cleanliness, attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Kevin Bradshaw, who specialized in elder law. I'd looked him up after learning his name from court documents. He had a reputation for aggressive advocacy and a track record of successful guardianship cases. Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes, but Sarah watched me with, and the expression I couldn't quite read. Concern? Guilt? Unmistakable? After months of seeing their actions through Margaret's documented observations, I could no longer trust my ability to interpret their motivations. The hearing was scheduled for family court, in a smaller room than the grand courtrooms you see on television. Judge Patricia Reeves presided, a woman in her 60s with gray hair and the kind of measured demeanor that suggested she'd seen every possible variation of family dysfunction. Kevin Bradshaw opened with a presentation that was both compelling and deeply disturbing in its distortion of reality. He painted a picture of a confused, isolated old man, making increasingly erratic decisions in the wake of his wife's death. The bank statements, showing Margaret's transfers, became evidence of my financial confusion. My donation to veterans' charities became proof of susceptibility to scams. Even my purchase of groceries and household supplies was reframed as hoarding behavior. Your Honor, Bradshaw concluded, Mr. Robert Hayes is a man in crisis. His judgment has been compromised by grief, and his ability to protect himself from financial exploitation has been severely diminished. His son Daniel and daughter-in-law Sarah are here not to gain control of his assets, but to ensure his safety and dignity in his remaining years. When it was Henry's turn, he began not with legal arguments, flushing, butterflies, question. Your Honor, what does it mean to lose your autonomy? He walked the judge through Margaret's timeline, showing how Daniel and Sarah's concerns had emerged in direct correlation with their research into elder care facilities, estate planning, and property values. He presented White Dr. Chen's assessment, which found no cognitive entities that would justify guardianship. He showed Marcus Webb's documentation of their pre-planning activities. Frontal people moment came when Henry presented Margaret's notebook. Your Honor, the deceased wife of Mr. Hayes was a woman of remarkable foresight. Sensing what might transpire after her death, She documented conversations and behaviors that she found concerning. With the court's permission, I'd like to read from her Visic's upschedule. Some of this upschedules is an upschedule, an upschedule, an upschedule. He read selected entries in Margaret's clear, careful handwriting. Dates, Rega 6, that revealed the calculated nature of Daniel and Sarah's interest in my future living arrangements and financial situation. The courtroom was silent as Henry's voice carried Margaret's words across the months that separated her from this moment. Then came the surprise that even I hadn't expected. I'd like to call Daniel Hayes to the stand. Daniel's face went white. His attorney objected, but Judge Reeves allowed it. Under oath, Henry began asking simple questions about Daniel's visits during Margaret's illness, his conversations about my presumption, his research into senior living options. Daniel tried to frame everything in terms of loving concern, but Henry's questions were surgical in their precision. Had Daniel visited real estate agents? Yes, but only to understand the current market. Had he researched senior living facilities? Yes, but only to be informed about options. Had he consulted with financial planners about inherited assets? Yes, but only to be prepared for responsibilities. Each admission, presented in sequence, built a picture of planning that went far beyond casual concern.
The turning point came when Henry asked about Christmas. Mr. Hayes, can you tell the court why you chose to spend Christmas Day in Vermont rather than with your recently widowed father?
Terminated the answer revealed everything. We thought it would be too difficult for him being reminded of Mom's absence. Windshield, we were trying to spare him that pain.
Fingers, yet you never discussed this decision with him directly.
Millie had made plans and Zoo made a unilateral decision about what was best for your father's emotional well-being without consulting him? The question hung in the air, and in the silence that followed, I think everyone in the courtroom understood what had really happened on Christmas Day. When Henry called me to testify, I spoke simply and directly about my life since Margaret's death. I talked about learning to cook for one, about maintaining our home, about the grief that was conserve and normal, but didn't impair my judgment. I talked about the veterans organizations I'd researched before donating, about the practical decisions I'd made about property maintenance and financial management. Most importantly, I talked about the difference, privileged, between needing support and needing control. Your Honor, I'm not claiming to be perfect. I'm 72 years old. I'm learning to live without my wife of 46 years. And yes, sometimes I make mistakes. But the question isn't whether I'm perfect. The question is whether I have the right to make my own imperfect decisions about my own life. Judge Reeves took a recess before rendering her decision. Henry, Dr. Chen, and I waited in a small conference arrest room, drinking bad coffee and trying to read meaning into the judge's expressions and questions. She's thorough, Henry said. That's good for us. Thorough judges look at evidence, not just emotions. When Judge vened, Judge Reeves spoke for 10 minutes about the delicate balance between protection and autonomy, about the court's responsibility to preserve independence whenever possible, and about the dangers of well-intentioned family members who confuse their own anxiety with genuine incapacity. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, she concluded, I find no basis for the emergency guardianship petition. Mr. Robert Hayes has demonstrated clear cognitive capacity, reasonable judgment, and the ability to manage his affairs independently. The petition is denied.
Though the relief I felt was so overwhelming that I had to grip the table to steady myself. Across the aisle, I saw Sarah's face crumple and at the floor. But Judge Reeves wasn't finished.
However, I am deeply troubled by what acquaint a pattern of manipulation and deception on the part of the petitioners.
Mr. Daniel Hayes and Mrs. Sarah Hayes, your testimonies suggest a troubling willingness to override your father's autonomy based on assumptions about his best interests that he never asked you to make. She ordered family counseling, which I knew would never happen, issued a restraining order preventing Daniel and Sarah from making any further legal moves regarding my care or finances without clear evidence of actual incapacity. As we left the courthouse, Daniel and Sarah walked quickly to their car without looking back. Their attorney shook hands with Henry in the professional courtesy that lawyers maintain, even after adversarial proceedings.
Your wife, Henry said, as we stood on the courthouse steps, saw all of this coming with remarkable clarity. She gave you exactly what you needed to protect yourself. That evening, I drove to Pine Grove and sat on the cabin's deck as darkness settled over the lake. The legal victory felt important, but it was also incomplete. I'd won the right to remain autonomous, but I'd lost something else, the illusion that my son loved me unconditionally, that family loyalty was stronger than financial opportunity. Sat open beside me, and I read again her final entry. Robert will face will choice after I'm gone. He can fight for his independence, or he can surrender it in the hope of maintaining peace with Daniel. I pray he chooses to fight, not because conflict is good, but because dignity requires it. Some relationships can only be preserved by compromising everything worth preserving about yourself. As stars appeared above the lake, I realized that Margaret's gift hadn't just been financial protection or legal preparation. She'd given me permission to value myself as much as I valued family harmony. For the first time in months, that felt like enough. Spring treff early to Pine Grove that year, the ice breaking up on the night in late March rather than its usual April thaw. I'd been spending more time at the cabin since the court hearing, not hiding exactly, but allowing myself the space Trey's Tim to think clearly about what came next. Feel victory had been decisive, but its emotional aftermath, distrust, was more complicated. Daniel and Sarah had retreated into silence after the hearing, making no attempt at reconciliation, Trey's Tim, or even acknowledgement of what had transpired in that courtroom. Their absence felt both like relief and like mourning. Relief from the constant tension of their manipulation, mourning for the relationship Trey's Tim I'd thought we had. When I was splitting firewood behind the cabin on a warm April morning, when I heard a car coming up the gravel drive. The engine sound was unfamiliar, not the quiet hum of my own Honda, not the rumble of the occasional treff truck. I set down the axe and walked around to the front of the cabin. A silver Subaru sat in my driveway, and getting out of the driver's seat was Daniel. He looked older than he had in the courthouse, grayer somehow, and he moved with the careful discriminate of someone who'd rehearsed this moment, but wasn't sure of his lines. He saw me watching from the porch and raised a tentative hand in greeting. Dad? It's okay that I came. I needed to see this place. I walked down the porch steps slowly, keeping my distance but not retreating. How did you find it? The court documents. The property deed was part of the evidence. He looked around at the cabin, the lake, the woods that surrounded Cordas. It's beautiful, really beautiful. I can see why Mom chose it. The mention of Margaret created a moment of shared grief that temporarily bridged the gulf between us. I saw something in Daniel's face that I recognized, the confusion of a man trying to reconcile the mother he'd loved with the woman who'd strategically protected her husband from her own son. She bought it 2 years before she died, I said. Never told me about it until after the hearing. Daniel nodded, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets.
Can we talk? I know I don't have any right to ask, but there are things I need timeouts. We sat on the dock, our feet dangling over water, beginning to warm from its winter chill. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. The theme silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. Just brush the quiet that comes before difficult truths. I read Mom's notebook, Daniel said finally. The legitimately lawyer showed it to us after the hearing. All those conversations she wrote down, all those things Sarah and I said. He paused, staring out over the lake. We sounded like vultures. I didn't respond immediately. Part of me wanted to reassure him, to minimize the damage and rebuild the bridge between us. But Margaret's voice was still clear in my memory, warning me about the cost of preserving relationships by compromising my own dignity. You were vultures, I said quietly. Daniel flinched, but he didn't argue. Yeah. And the worst part is, I don't think we even realized it. Sarah's family, when her grandfather died, there was this whole ugly, brushed battle over his estate. Her father and uncle fought for years, spent thousands on lawyers, all because nobody had planned ahead. To plan ahead for me? We were being practical, responsible, that we were protecting you from having to make difficult decisions while you were grieving. He picked up a small stone and tossed it into the water. But really, we were protecting ourselves from uncertainty, from the possibility that you might make choices we didn't agree with. It was the most honest thing Daniel had said to me in years, maybe ever. I found myself remembering the little boy who used to help me wash the car, who would explain exactly broken a lamp or tracked mud through the house. That capacity for honesty had been there once. What changed, unauthorized? Daniel was quiet for a long time. When he finally answered, his voice was barely audible over the gentle lap of water against the dock. Sarah's pregnant, unborn. The words hit me like a physical blow. A grandchild, the continuation of our family line, a new generation that might regale the wounds of this one. And Daniel was telling me, here, beside Margaret's hidden alphabetical, in the aftermath of a legal mean battle that had torn our relationship apart. Blankets, flooring, I managed. She's due in October. We found out right after Mom died. But with everything that was happening, with your grief and the estate issues, we decided to wait to tell you. Another decision made for me. Another choice about my own life taken out of my hands. But this time, I could see the fear behind it, prevailing, of new parents facing responsibility they weren't sure they could handle. Looking at aging parents as both resources and liabilities. Dad, we were scared. Scared about money, about childcare, about how we were going to afford a house with enough space for a family. And we looked at everything you and Mom had built, and we convinced ourselves that you'd want to help, that it was the natural progression of things. In prison, taking control of my life? Bombarded by making sure nothing got laissez? By making sure the resources were used efficiently? He shook his head. God, that sounds terrible when I say it out loud. Sounds like Sarah talking. Daniel's head snapped toward me. That's not fair, isn't it? You used to make your own decisions, Daniel. When did you start letting her make them for you? She doesn't make my decisions. We're partners. We discuss things. We plan together. You planned my future together. You researched senior living facilities together. You filed for guardianship together. But did you ever, even once, ask me what I wanted? The questions hung between us, and in his silence I had my answer. From across the lake, its voice wild and lonely, and somehow perfect for the moment. I thought about Margaret, about the months she'd spent watching our son transform from a loving caregiver into someone who saw her dying husband as a problem to be managed. "I'm going to be a grandfather," I said finally. "Richmond, if you want to be. I know we screwed everything up. I know you have every right to cut us out of your life. But this baby, it's going to be your grandchild too." When there it was, the choice Margaret had anticipated, the decision between holding on to my anger and making space for a future I hadn't planned. What does Sarah think about this conversation? Daniel looked uncomfortable. She doesn't know I'm here. She thinks I should let you cool off for a while longer before we try to make contact. She's embarrassed about what happened in court. Embarrassed. The judge made it pretty clear what she thought of our motives, and reading Mom's notebook, regulate ourselves through her eyes. It was ugly, Dad. Really ugly. I stood up from the dock, my knees creaking in protest, and his feet beside me. "I need time to think about this," I said, "about what kind of recharge we might have going forward, about what kind of grandfather I want to be." "I understand. I'll wait as long as you need." "No," I said firmly. "You'll wait as long as I decide you need to wait. There's a difference." For the first time in our conversation, Daniel smiled, a rueful expression that reminded me of the boy who used to accept consequences for his actions without argument. Fair enough. After he left, I sat on the cabin's porch until the sun set behind the trees. The conversation had shifted something fundamental in my understanding of the past several months. Daniel and Sarah's actions were still inexcusable, but they were comprehensible in a way they hadn't been before. The desperate choices of young adults facing responsibilities that felt overwhelming. That didn't make their behavior acceptable, but it made forgiveness possible. Not forgiveness as surrender, but forgiveness as a choice, passionately rather than weakness. Margaret's notebook was upstairs in the cabin's bedroom. I brought it down to the porch and read through her observations again, this time looking for signs of the fear and uncertain Daniel and Sarah's. Planning. Nee found it in the margins, comments she'd made but crossed out, questions she'd asked herself their motivations, moments of doubt about her own harsh assessment of their character. She'd seen their failures, but she'd also seen their irremeant. And she'd trusted me to navigate that complexity when the time came. As stars appeared over Pine Grove, I realized that Margaret's final gift wasn't just protection from Daniel and Sarah's schemes. It was the confidence to engage with them from a position of strength, to offer relationship on my terms rather than theirs. A grandchild was coming. A new generation that would carry forward some combination of our family's best and worst qualities. Whether I would be part of that child's life, and on what terms, remained to be decided. But for the first time since Christmas Day, those decisions felt like Northwestern to make. 6 months later, I was standing in the Pine Oak cabin's nursery, putting the finishing touches. The wood was maple, from trees that had grown on the property, milled at a local sawmill, tarnafted with joints that would last generations. It was October, and the leaves outside the window blazed with the colors Margaret had always loved best. The room itself was simple. Pale yellow walls, white curtains, a rocking chair positioned to catch the morning light. Nothing fancy, but everything chosen with care. This would be where my granddaughter spent weekends and summer vacations, where she'd learn to fish, pen in the dock, and identify bird calls, and understand that she came from people who valued both independence and connection. Yes, granddaughter. Sarah had given birth 3 weeks ago to a perfectly healthy baby girl they'd named Margaret Rose. Maggie for short. The name had been Daniel's suggestion, a gesture toward reconciliation that carried weight precisely because Sarah had agreed to it. The path to this moment hadn't been simple or quick. After Daniel's visit to the cabin, I'd spent weeks thinking about what kind of relationship I wanted with my son going forward, what boundaries needed to misunderstand, and what compromises I am willing to make. The conversation that changed everything happened in late June, in the neutral territory of Henry Morrison's office. I'd asked Daniel and Sarah to meet me there, with Henry present as both witness and mediator, to discuss the terms of our future relationship. Why to be clear about something I'd said that day? What happened between us, the guardianship petition, the manipulation, the attempt to control my commute, that can't happen again, ever. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be based on respect, frightened for my autonomy. Though Sarah had looked genuinely chastened in a way she hadn't during the court proceedings. Pregnancy had softened her edges somehow. Or maybe it was the realization that she would soon be on the other side of the parent-child dynamic. "We understand," she'd said. "We were wrong. Not just about the legal stuff, but about the way we approached everything. We should have talked to you directly, instead of making assumptions about what you needed." "And the money?" I'd asked. "The house, the investments, all the assets you were so concerned about managing?" Daniel had answered that one. "It's yours. DMA. Earn our own way. Take care of our own family. No expectations, no claims on what you've, Kensington, built." That conversation led to others, gradually rebuilding trust through small gestures and careful boundaries. I helped them find a different house. Not the large suburban home they'd originally wanted, but a modest colonial in Millfield that they could afford without counting on inheritances. I babysit occasionally, but always by invitation, cutoff, rather than obligation. I attend family dinners, but I also maintain my Independence Grove. Most importantly, I've begun turning the cabin property into something larger than a personal retreat. The transformation started with a call to the American Legion in late spring. I'd been thinking about Margaret's suggestion that the property eventually become a veterans retreat, and I decided not to wait freezes until after my death to make that happen. "What we're talking about," I'd explained to the Legion's regional director, "is a program that's already been successful in a handful of other rural communities. The American Legion, in conjunction with local law enforcement, is setting up a camp for men returning from combat who've lost limbs to make sure they're properly rehabilitated and can reintegrate into civilian life. The idea was to have the veterans of our region be the first, so that as a group we'd know what to expect." I told the director the Legion would be more than happy to take my cabin off my hands. We'd have plenty of room, and we'd even be willing to pay a small monthly rental fee for the space, which would go toward paying for the veterans' medical care. In return for the cabin, we'd ask that the Legion give us a few minutes each month to speak at a local community center about the program and about what the Legion does for its veterans. A little public education, regional director, is a place where veterans and their families can come for weekends or longer stays. Fishing, hiking, just being in a peaceful place where nobody asks questions about what you've seen or done. When? The response had been immediate and enthusiastic. Within weeks, we had a plan to expand the Republicy into a small complex, the original building as a main lodge with 4 smaller cabins scattered through the woods for privacy, a workshop for therapeutic woodworking, and a larger dock for group activities. The financing, not all of them, but enough to get started. Margaret's careful asset protection had left me with more flexibility than I'd realized, and the Pine Grove Veterans Retreat felt like a worthy use of what she'd preserved. The first guests would arrive in November, 3 Vietnam veterans and their wives, recommended by the Legion as men who would benefit from some quiet time away from the world's demands. I'd spent the summer preparing
Not just the physical facilities, but my own understanding of what it meant to offer sanctuary. Now, as I adjusted the mobile, M hanging over Maggie's crib, wooden fish cut from pine grove maple, painted in colors that would catch her infant attention, asked had changed since that Christmas morning when I'd opened my door to find a FedEx delivery instead of my family. The pain of that abandonment hadn't disappeared entirely. Sometimes I still felt the sting of being so casually discarded, still struggled with the knowledge that my son had been capable of such calculated cruelty. But the pain had been joined by something stronger, the satisfaction of choices made from strength rather than weakness, of relationships rebuilt, married on better foundations. Margaret's voice was still clear in my memory, especially here at Pine Grove, Flushing where her foresight felt most present. But her voice no longer carried warnings about dangers to avoid. Now it carried encouragement about possibilities to embrace. A knock at the cabin's front door interrupted my thoughts. Through the window, I could see Daniel's Subaru in the driveway, and Daniel himself standing on the porch with a baby carrier in his arms. "Dad?" he called. "We're here for Maggie's first visit to her cabin." I opened the door to find my son holding my granddaughter, her tiny face visible beneath a pink knit cap. Sarah stood behind them, carrying a diaper bag and familiarity with the particular exhaustion of new motherhood. "She's been fussing all morning," Sarah said, but she fell asleep the minute Zimbabwe we turned onto the cabin road. "I think she likes it here already." Led them upstairs to the nursery, watching Daniel's face as hometown, as sheets the rocking chair, the careful preparation I'd made for his daughter's visits. "Kang," he said softly, "this is beautiful. Really brushed beautiful." I took Maggie from his arms, carefully, the way you hold something infinitely precious, and settled into. She opened her eyes briefly, fixing me with the intense tattoo used to catalog the world, then closed them again and redeemed into sleep. "She has Margaret's chin," I said, "and your stubborn streak." "According to the pediatrician," Sarah added. "She has very abling-ite opinions about when she wants to eat and sleep." Outside the nursery window, the lake reflected the afternoon sun in patterns of light that danced across the ceiling. This room would see many more afternoons like this one, not just with Maggie, but with the veterans' families who would find their own healing in Pine Grove's quiet beauty. "Dad," Daniel said, "I want you to know something. What you're doing here, with the retreat center, with giving families a place sunlight to heal, it's exactly what Mom would have wanted. She always said the best way to honor the past was to build something good for the future." We looked down at Maggie sleeping peacefully in her grandfather's arms and thought about the future she would inherit. Not just financial assets or property, but the knowledge that love could survive betrayal, that families could rebuild themselves on stronger foundations, that dignity was worth fighting for even when the battle cost more than surrender. Margaret had seen this moment coming too, I realized, not the specific details, but the essential truth, that the Christmas morning which had felt like an ending was actually a beginning, the beginning of a life lived on my own terms, with relationships based on respect rather than obligation, with resources used to create things larger than myself. The beginning of understanding that family isn't just what you're born into, it's what you choose to build. As the sun set over Pine Grove, painting the lake in shades old and crimson, I rocked my granddaughter out about the story I would tell her someday, about her grandmother's wisdom about the importance of standing affect ourself, about the difference between love that controls and love that liberates. But that story could wait. For now, it was enough to hold her, the room her grandmother had planned, in the cabin that had become both sanctuary and legacy,
surrounded by the quiet beauty of a life reclaimed. Outside, loons called across the water, their voices wild and free and perfect for the moment. Inside, 3 generations of the Hayes family sat together in the golden light, writing the first pages of presumption that would be different from the one that came before. Not because we'd avoided all pain, but because we'd chosen to transform pain into something stronger. Margaret would have been proud.